0642 a.m. on October 22, near the jagged coral edge of Sabina Shoal, the South China Sea stopped being a zone of political tension and violence. The crew of the small Philippine supply vessel Uniza May 2 didn't hear a warning siren first. They heard a scream of tearing metal. The morning sun was CCG 5203, a Chinese Coast Guard cutter displacing 4 times their weight. It was not a navigational error, it was a calculated T-bone collision executed at 15 knots. As the wooden hull of the Filipino boat splintered and seawater rushed into the engine room, the sailors realized they weren't just victims of a collision, they were the targets of a weaponized hull. When targets of state-sanctioned boat in disputed waters, his just witnessed the first shot of a kinetic war. To understand why a simple resupply mission turned into a demolition derby, one must look past the waves and into the war room strategies in Beijing. This collision was not an isolated act of road rage. It was the physical manifestation of the Cabbage Strategy. This doctrine, meticulously crafted by PLA planners, involves wrapping a disputed territory in successive layers of blockade, like the leaves of a cabbage. The inner layer consists of the maritime militia, the so-called Little Blue Men in steel-hulled fishing trawlers. The middle layer is the China Coast Guard CCG operating cutters larger than many US Navy destroyers. The outer layer is the PLA Navy lurking just over the horizon. The objective at Sabina Shoal is not just to patrol, it is to strangle. By cutting off supplies to Philippine outposts, Beijing aims to force a surrender through starvation and rust without ever firing a missile. This zone lies well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone EEZ, a fact upheld by the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling in The Hague. Under international law, the Philippine Coast Guard has every right to be there. But Beijing does not operate on international law. It operates on the 9-dash line and the principle of effective control. They are exploiting the gray zone, the murky space between peace and war. By using water cannons, military-grade lasers, and hull collisions, instead of anti-ship missiles, China forces its adversaries into an impossible dilemma. If the Philippines fires back with naval guns, they are branded as the aggressors who started World War III. If they do nothing, they lose their territory inch by inch. This asymmetry creates a dangerous game of chicken. The Philippine vessels are often repurposed wooden-hulled boats or aging steel craft, weighing a few hundred tons at most. They are trying to hold the line against CCG monster ships like the Zhao class, which displace 12,000 tons. It is a contest of physics that Manila cannot win, and on this particular morning, the Chinese captain decided to stop posturing and start crushing. Long before the physical hulls collided, the ambush had already begun in the electromagnetic spectrum. At 0300 a.m., under the cloak of a moonless night, the Philippine supply convoy, consisting of the small Uniza May 2 and its Coast Guard escort, the BRP Cabra, cut their running lights and initiated a silent run towards the shoal. Their strategy was simple but desperate: use the darkness and the clutter of the waves to slip past the Chinese blockade picket line. On the bridge, the Filipino captain monitored the automatic identification system, AIS display, praying for empty water. But the screen was lying. Unknown to the Filipino crew, Chinese Dark Fleet militia vessels had already engaged in extensive AIS spoofing, manipulating their transponder signals to appear as harmless fishing boats operating miles away or simply vanishing from the digital map entirely. But while they were digitally invisible, their sensors were wide open. High-frequency surface wave radar from the hovering CCG cutters had likely tracked the Philippine wake signatures hours ago. The cat had seen the mouse the moment it left the dock in Palawan. As dawn broke, the trap snapped shut. The horizon, which the Filipino crew hoped would be clear, suddenly filled with the grey silhouettes of the China Coast Guard and the blue hulls of the maritime militia. They hadn't just stumbled into a patrol. They had walked into a prepared killbox. The Chinese vessels were not reacting. They were waiting. They had positioned themselves in a classic pincer formation, calculating the exact intercept vectors to cut off any retreat. The Filipino captain gripped the wheel, realizing that his radar's silence had been a fatal deception. He was piloting a wooden boat into a gauntlet of steel armed with nothing but a camera and a prayer against an adversary that had wargamed this exact scenario 1,000 times. The dance of avoidance ended abruptly at 0641 a.m. The Chinese Coast Guard vessel 5203, a massive steel leviathan designed for open ocean endurance, executed a sharp, aggressive turn to port. In naval maneuvering terms, this is known as cutting the bow, a high-risk blocking maneuver intended to force a smaller vessel to kill its engines to avoid collision. But this time, the geometry of the intercept was too tight, and the aggression was too raw. The Filipino captain slammed his throttle into emergency astern the engines, screaming as the propellers churned the water into white foam, trying to fight the laws of inertia. but physics is unforgiving. The Philippine supply boat, laden with provisions and construction materials, carried too much forward momentum. The distance to the Chinese hull closed from 50 meters to zero in the blink of an eye. The impact was not a glancing blow. It was a kinetic hammer strike. The starboard bow of the CCG 5203 slammed into the port quarter of the Uniza May 2. With the sickening crunch of steel, deforming wood, and aluminum, the sound was deafening, a mixture of grinding metal, shattering fiberglass, and the deep resonant boom of the hull impact that vibrated through the skeletal structure of the smaller boat. Inside the Philippine bridge, crew members were thrown violently against bulkheads and consoles. Coffee cups, charts, and unsecured equipment became projectiles. The vessel listed dangerously to starboard, taking on water as the sheer mass of the Chinese ship literally pushed it sideways, dragging it through the sea like a toy. For 10 terrifying seconds, the two ships were locked together, grinding hull to hull, the Chinese superstructure towering over the Filipinos like a skyscraper looming over a shack. The friction stripped the paint and buckled the railings of the supply boat, threatening to capsize it entirely in the choppy wake. But the assault didn't end with the collision. As the vessels separated, the Chinese cutter unleashed its secondary battery, the high-pressure water cannons. This wasn't a warning spray. It was a directed attack. Two streams of seawater, pressurized to over 200 pounds per square inches, hammered the superstructure of the crippled supply boat. At close range, a water cannon hits with the force of a sledgehammer. The torrent smashed into the bridge windows, shattering the toughened glass and sending shards flying into the cockpit. The water flooded the control station, shorting out navigation consoles and soaking the bridge crew who were already reeling from the collision. The Filipino captain, bleeding from glass cuts, struggled to regain steerage, shouting orders over the roar of the water and the wail of damage control alarms. This was no longer a grey zone pushing match. By physically ramming a vessel and then targeting its bridge crew with high-pressure jets, the Chinese Coast Guard had crossed the threshold into direct kinetic combat. They weren't trying to block the ship. They were trying to disable it and potentially kill the crew inside. In the chaos of the flooded bridge, with the hull groaning under the stress and the radio screaming for help, the crew of the Uniza May 2 realized the terrifying truth. They were unarmed, sinking, and locked in a cage with a predator that had just tasted blood. Chaos reigned on the deck of the Uniza May 2. "Damage control parties sound off," shouted the executive officer, as crew members scrambled over the slick, debris-strewn deck. Portable bilge pumps were deployed to fight the ingress of water in the aft compartments, while medics rushed to treat lacerations caused by the shattered bridge windows. Despite the battering, the Filipino crew displayed a stubborn, drilled professionalism. They didn't return fire, they had no heavy weapons to fire, but they refused to sink or surrender. The captain managed to keep the battered prow pointed toward the shoal, using the vessel's shallow draft to maneuver where the massive Chinese cutter couldn't follow without running aground. But the most critical defensive move didn't come from the water, it came from the sky. At 18,000 feet, a US Navy P-8, a Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, banked sharply, its high-resolution MX-20 electro-optical sensors fixing directly on the collision. The presence of the American eye in the sky changed the tactical calculus instantly. The Chinese commander knew that every maneuver, every ram, and every water cannon blast was being recorded in 4K resolution and streamed directly to US Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. The gray zone relies on ambiguity, but the P-8 removed the shadows. Confronted with the undeniable presence of the American military witness, the CCG vessels pulled back, slightly switching tactics from kinetic battering to psychological warfare. They blasted their long-range acoustic devices LRAD, sending piercing, pain-inducing sound waves toward the Filipino crew. It was a standoff, the battered Filipino boat refusing to die, the Chinese giant looming like a bully caught on camera, and the American aircraft circling like a silent vulture, waiting for a reason to intervene. The collision at Sabina Shoal was not a contest of seamanship. It was a brutal demonstration of engineering asymmetry. To understand the hopelessness of the Philippine position, one must look at the tail of the tape. The Chinese vessel involved belongs to the Zhao class, the world's largest Coast Guard cutter. Displacing over 12,000 tons, it is larger than a US Navy Arleigh Burke-class destroyer and armed with 76mm rapid-fire guns. Its hull is reinforced steel designed originally for ice-breaking operations or naval combat survival. In stark contrast, the Philippine Uniza May-class vessels are often converted civilian designs or light patrol craft, displacing barely 100 to 400 tons with hulls made of wood or thin aluminum. When a 12,000-ton object impacts a 400-ton object at 15 knots, the physics are absolute. The kinetic energy transfer is catastrophic. The Chinese captain used his ship's mass as a kinetic weapon, effectively turning the prow of the cutter into a slow-moving torpedo. This tactic allows Beijing to inflict mission kills, disabling the enemy vessel without ever uncovering their gun batteries, thereby skirting the definitions of an armed attack. Furthermore, the use of water cannons represents a calculated evolution in gray zone weaponry. These are not firefighting hoses, they are industrial-grade hydraulic weapons capable of generating pressures exceeding 1500 kilopascals, approx 200 pounds per square inches. At close range, this stream hits with enough force to bend radar masts, shatter ballistic glass, and cause blunt force trauma to human bodies. It is a soft kill system, designed to degrade the target's electronic situational awareness and terrorize the crew without sinking the ship outright. This fits perfectly into China's strategy of escalation dominance. They have integrated the Coast Guard and the maritime militia into a single data-linked swarm, where the militia acts as the sensor network and the CCG acts as the hammer. The ramming and water cannoning are not accidents. They are standard operating procedures in a doctrine that views the hull of the ship as just another munition in the magazine. They have weaponized physics itself, knowing that international law has no clear answer for a war fought with bows and water instead of missiles and shells. The shockwaves of this collision traveled far beyond the South China Sea, crashing directly into the halls of power in Washington and Manila. The immediate fallout was diplomatic fury. Manila summoned the Chinese ambassador playing the raw footage of the ramming on loop to dismantle Beijing's denial. But the real impact was strategic. The United States State Department issued its sternest warning, yet explicitly stating that an armed attack on Philippine public vessels, including the Coast Guard, would invoke the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. This statement moved the red line right up to the hull of the Chinese cutters. Beijing is testing the definition of armed attack. By using rams and water cannons, they are betting that the US won't start a nuclear war over a dented supply boat. However, this gamble creates a terrifying precedent for the entire Indo-Pacific. If China can normalize the ramming of sovereign vessels without triggering a military response, they effectively rewrite the rules of engagement for the entire region. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia are watching closely. They know that if the Philippines breaks under this pressure, the monster ships will turn toward their waters next. The collision at Sabina Shoal has stripped away the illusion of a peaceful rise. It has forced the US and its allies to consider placing armed escorts on supply convoys, a move that would put American destroyers and Chinese cutters in direct kinetic confrontation. The margin for error has vanished. We are no longer dealing with a gray zone. We are staring at a fuse that has already been lit. Beijing calls it law enforcement. The Philippines calls it harassment. But what happened at Sabina Shoal was neither. It was a kinetic experiment. The collision between CCG 5203 and the Uniza May 2 proved that the South China Sea has evolved from a contest of maps to a contest of steel. We are witnessing the dangerous normalization of violence where 12,000-ton ships are used as battering rams to enforce a claim that no international court recognizes. The strategy is clear: break the ships, break the will, and break the alliance without ever pulling a trigger. But there is a flaw in this logic. Metal has a breaking point, and so does patience. As the hulls of Philippine vessels buckle under the weight of Chinese coercion, the diplomatic crumple zone that has kept the peace for decades is disappearing. The next collision might not just shatter glass, it might shatter the fragile peace of the Pacific. We are one bad captain's decision away from turning a gray zone into a red zone. If you think a fender bender is scary on the highway, imagine it with warships carrying cruise missiles. The ocean is vast, but the margin for error is now zero. If you want to understand the weapons waiting behind these Coast Guard cutters, make sure to subscribe. In our next briefing, we're going deep into the carrier killers of the PLA rocket force. You won't want to miss it. Bye for now.